This is a weird tangent, but whatever happened to poetry as an art form? When I mention the word poetry, maybe it brings out some sort of reaction in you, whether that be cringe, mildly interested, or maybe in the rare case, you're a huge fan.
Whoa.
Whatever the case may be, it's hard to argue that poetry hasn't become widely viewed as uncool in pop culture, to say the least. This isn't to say that poetry is irrelevant. In fact, there are more people participating in and enjoying poetry more than ever before. And this might seem obvious to you because there are more people in the world than ever before, but even in comparison to other forms of media, poetry is definitely becoming less and less cool, sort of seen as less popular. So what is it about poetry that made it fall off in pop culture? First of all, in order to become better acquainted with poetry, we should take a look at its history. The history of poetry goes way back, almost as far back as humans could communicate. It is likely that poetry even predates the written text. This part is really interesting because a lot of people associate New School poetry with slam poetry and spoken word. However, this goes all the way back to the very origins of poetry itself to be spoken. The earliest form of poetry exists in the form of hymns and other songs like chants that are closely tied to religious subject matter. Early forms of poetry can be traced back to our earliest civilizations, such as Egypt, Sumeria, and Mesopotamia. Poetry was utilized as a means to make longer stories easier to remember and tell them more often. This makes sense because you might not be able to remember a story's plot, but you can somehow remember all of the nursery rhymes that you were sung as a kid. Poetry continued to grow in ancient Greece with the contributions of renowned poets like Homer with his epic poems The Iliad and the Odyssey, which shaped the capabilities and bounds of poetry throughout history. In ancient Greece, poetry could take the form of epics, dramatics, and lyrics. Much of the history of poetry was inherited by the Roman Empire and continued to evolve into the Middle Ages, being of course revived during the Renaissance era, which saw a sort of re-emergence of art and poetry. Shakespeare lived during the Renaissance era and left a mark on poetic history forever, with his plays and 154 sonnets exploring themes like love, beauty, and tragedy through Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, and much more. We study Shakespeare today because of how his poetry, prose, diction, and general innovation of the English language shaped the way that we write and speak forever. And it serves as a looking glass into the life and values of humans during his lifetime. Poetry continued to grow after the Renaissance era and into the Romantic era, but for many of us who have studied poetry in school, the history of poetry seems to have began and ended with Shakespeare. As we looked into the 20th century and to modern poetry, it feels like we're at the bottom end of the popularity curve. Why is that? This brings us to a comparison of values throughout history. What has really changed since then? Well, back in the day, when poetry was at its peak, it had some sense of novelty. There was new advancements to the capabilities of poetry, and people were doing new things, taking language in a direction that people never expected. So much so that nowadays it's almost easier to explain poetry in terms of what it is not rather than what it is. For example, take a look at the world's shortest poems. This one right here is the shortest poem ever, and this was written by Aram Saroyan in the mid-1960s, and it's just an M with 4 legs, and yet it is still considered a poem. Or how about this one? It's an I, but instead of the dot, it's a fingerprint. I like the second one a little bit more personally. But the point is, what makes a poem isn't very clear. That's because poetry has actually morphed into almost every other art form. This means that it's actually more efficient to enjoy poetry at the same time as something else. For example, accompanied by a beat and a melody to make music, or in posters, movies, shows, podcasts, or anything else that we consume today. There are so many things that are competing for our attention that if we're talking about written poetry, the value proposition of sitting down and reading or writing a poem, it just doesn't seem worth it. After all, what's the point of a poem? Is poetry useless? I would argue that there are actually many benefits of reading and writing poetry. The first one is that it's actually a great method of self-expression. Allowing yourself to think on a feeling or emotion or situation long enough to put it into a poem allows you to articulate your inner thoughts, and it promotes self-awareness and well-being. This can even lead to emotional catharsis as an outlet for your most bottled up feelings. You can start by getting a notepad and jotting down your thoughts. It doesn't even need to rhyme or have a specific structure. Just write down what's on your mind. This is where reading or listening to other poetry comes in. Over time, your words can develop a flow with each other, creating more advanced styles and forms like a haiku. Finding a style of poetry that you can enjoy can be a fun exercise in finding your own voice to create poetry that expresses how you feel. As an added benefit, this will allow you to further develop empathy and connections with other people and become a better listener as you learn to relate more with others. So to summarize, let's answer the question, what happened to poetry? Well, it evolved. Poetry is not enjoyed mostly in the same way as it used to be. Poetry has changed over time, and it lent itself to other mediums to share life's important messages. I think Robert Frost said it best. Poetry is when an emotion has found its thought, and the thought has found words. Poetry is not really a genre. It's more of a medium to tell a story or share a feeling or emotion. So when people say stuff like poetry is dead, maybe we should start asking, which kind of poetry?